So here are some examples in which perception alternately is and is not malleable. In this optical illusion, you feel as though these two objects are not the same size and shape. We can logically know that they are, but that does not change your experience of them. In these situations, it is often useful to use another object or device to obscure your vision of the whole. What that does for us is it blocks our perspective algorithms so they do not take effect, but as soon as you remove the obstruction, the original perception returns. When presented with a logical proof of an illusion where the perception does not change, the response is often to adjust your language. You train yourself to give the correct answer even though you feel compelled to believe otherwise. But this is more difficult to do when the perception is as reality defining as the sense of your own existence. But as I said before, information in the brain is not a one-way street, so there are often situations where you can consciously manipulate your own perceptual focus to see or experience something new. I'm sure you're familiar with images like this, where you originally only saw the old woman or the young lady, and then later realized that the other image coexisted within the picture. If you think these are all just more examples of the same thing, that these are all just somehow passive events, then what about this one? In my absurdity video, I showed you a Ferris wheel that can turn both clockwise and counterclockwise depending on how you want to look at it. It may initially seem as though it can only go in one direction, but with a little bit of practice, you'll soon find that you can make it go the other way at will. Of course, the reality of the situation is that the movement itself is an illusion. The pixels representing the image aren't going anywhere, but you get my point. You might have realized that I haven't actually finished my God is Not God series, and the reason for that is I still have a lot to flesh out in terms of my script and how I'm going to explain how music affects the brain and why it has to be so complicated. But having long since finished neuroscientist Dr. Daniel Levinson's book, This Is Your Brain on Music, and since I couldn't wait any longer to put this video out, I wanted to explain a few more things. Many regions of the brain that are responsible for the comprehension of language are either overlapping with, adjacent to, or have corresponding regions for processing music. Studies have shown that when brain damage is incurred such that the ability to process language is affected, oftentimes some portion of the ability to comprehend music is also affected. In fact, in Dr. Oliver Sacks's book, Musicophilia, he explains that the relationship between music and language is such that that when someone is afflicted with an inability to communicate, whether it's from a debilitating stuttering to some forms of autism to some forms of aphasia where people cannot recall words, that oftentimes those symptoms can be alleviated and to some extent bypassed by entering into sing-song language, or just plainly by singing. And that's why many institutions actually offer music therapy, because by using different regions of the brain, they can recall words that would otherwise be unavailable to some people. And these structures are similar enough that they can assist in the formation of grammatically correct sentences. So it allows those people to restore some of their communicative abilities and to reestablish a connection with other humans. But if you want to know a lot more about that, I really recommend the quintessential book, Music, Language, and the Brain by Ani Patel. There's really a lot more to go into there, but obviously I just don't have time here, and I don't want to overwhelm anyone just yet. But ever since the rediscovery of Vernon Mountcastle's brilliant work, it's been increasingly believed by the neuroscientific community that the circuits for processing music and language were once highly intermixed. In fact, it's believed that most of our senses start off as rather merged, and that from inside the womb and onward, we continually differentiate our circuits based on experiential application, such that different regions take on different specialties based on the information that they are exposed to. And all of that happens by a process, or a phenomenon rather, called neuroplasticity, the basic properties of which were explained quite well by Dr. Norman Doidge in his book, The Brain That Changes Itself. Neuroplasticity, by the way, it describes the propensity of a neural network to change its physical configuration based largely on applied stimulation. So, what I find rather fascinating about all these subjects is that while it would be incorrect to take it literally, I find it rather intriguing that we really were rather close when we first started saying that music speaks to us. In talking about the pars orbitalis in the Brodmann area 47, Levitin says the following: "Most astonishing was that the left hemisphere regions that we found were active in tracking musical structure were the very same ones that are active when deaf people are communicating by sign language. This suggested that what we had identified in the brain wasn't a region that simply processed whether a chord sequence was sensible or whether a spoken sentence was sensible. We were now looking at a region that responded to sight, to the visual organization of words conveyed through American Sign Language. We found evidence for the existence of a brain region that processes structure in general when that structure is conveyed over time. Although the inputs to this region must have come from different neural populations and the outputs of it had to go through distinctive networks, there it was, a region that kept popping up in any task that involved organizing information over time. So I want to propose something. We know that we perceive things that do not actually exist in the world around us. For example, not only do we perceive color, but we perceive it in 3 dimensions. And we know full well that color is just a phenomenon that is restricted to biological interpretation of environmental information, that color is not something that exists external to any organism's experience. So we know that we perceive things that do not actually exist in the world around us. So regardless of whether or not the universe is designed, what if we perceive it anyway? What if with the pars orbitalis examining structure over time, with a temporal lobe that is capable of looking for and examining syntax, meaning, and familiarity, with a prefrontal cortex that can rationalize various experiences, and an overall brain that is capable of spontaneously forming new connections, what if the basis of spirituality is the observation of environmental relationships over time, such that we become subconsciously responsive to the pattern of neural activity that is active when we seek to interpret information such as language and music? What if there's a reason why people the world over, from laymen to educators of the highest credentials, people have often talked about a universe that speaks to us? What if by entertaining the notion of design, we are forming new connections such that a new perception is reflected back at us whenever we see similar relationships elsewhere in our environment?
And so I feel, and I use words. I bask in the majesty of the cosmos. I use words, compose sentences that sound like the sentences I hear out of people who had revelations of Jesus, who go on their pilgrimages to Mecca. There's some commonality of feeling. I know it. Well, I don't know it. I want someone to do that experiment, because the day you do, if the same centers in my brain are excited by these cosmic thoughts as what are going on in the mind of a religious person, that's something to know. That's going to be really interesting finding. And as far as I can tell, if you let them know that it's not something that we're in the universe, but in fact, given the chemistry of it all and the nuclear physics of it all, not only are we in the universe is in us. And I don't know any deeper spiritual feeling than what that brings upon me. And I just wanted to leave you with those thoughts. Thank you.
I don't think that if such a thing existed, if there were a biological basis for a perception of design, that such a thing would be hardwired for, again, the reasons I just mentioned. I'll talk about neuroplasticity and some other implications in a later video, but I just want to propose for the moment that perhaps there really is something going on at the subconscious level, something that perhaps we could validate through science, and that, at least in the meantime, we could use to keep ourselves in check in terms of being honest with ourselves and not just ridiculing anyone who has a different perspective on the situation. And I think it would also explain why we keep encountering these recurring themes in these sorts of discussions, things that often relate to the inference of design. And the problem that I have with atheists and the way that we typically approach the inference of design is that we have 3 typical responses. The first and most fallacious one is to simply say that snowflakes or something within nature is not designed, therefore the universe is probably not designed. The problem there, of course, being that one is assuming what one is concluding, and then ironically using that as a refutation for someone else who's doing exactly the same thing. But I just want to focus on the other 2. The other 2 approaches that atheists commonly have is to ask for evidence of the designer and to ridicule the failure in logic in jumping from the observation that something appears designed to the conclusion that something is designed. And there's a problem there because, as Thomas Jefferson said, ridicule is the only weapon which can be used against unintelligible propositions. Ideas must be concrete before reason can act upon them. So if a proposition is so completely unintelligible that the only valid response is ridicule, then in what possible scenario could it ever be productive to ask for evidence? In what situation could you ever find any sense of accomplishment or efficacy in terms of pursuing validation for something that is so nebulous that you don't even understand what you're supposed to be substantiating in the first place? It doesn't make any sense. I think the truth of the matter is that atheists really do sympathize with the theistic tendency to want to ascribe design to something that has a certain amount of complexity and that has a certain amount of function. And I think up until now we simply have not had a mechanism for examining those sorts of ideas and arguments. Which, again, is why I think my God is Not God series is so effective, is because it directly addresses the perception of intelligence and how that weighs on the inference of design. And with the discrepancy between how we argue for the existence of intelligence and how we actually perceive it and act upon it in our daily lives, if one of those two is going to give, I think it's going to be the argument for it. Because if you think your boss is an idiot, that's probably not going to change unless they start doing something drastically different. So if the argument for intelligence has to change in order to coincide with the way that we interact with it in our daily lives, I think that will have profound implications on the sorts of arguments that other people can form in terms of why people think that they have found evidence for the existence of a God. But concurrently with all of that, and kind of back to my main point, is that I've been reading a book by Jeff Hawkins called On Intelligence, and not surprisingly, all of the arguments that he makes are completely compatible with mine, and in fact mine explain why he has to make some of the criticisms that he does. And he points out that complexity is a symptom of confusion, not a cause, that however complicated something may initially seem, it will be immediately much simpler once you understand it, that you can remove the extraneous information and reorganize what's left into something that's much more coherent. But he also points out that before Darwin, it used to be considered the acme of biological insight to realize when two different organisms were of different species. Darwin's insight was that he realized that people were focusing too narrowly on the differences and not enough on the similarities, that by expanding his perceptual focus he was able to connect more dots, and of course from that flowed the theory of evolution by natural selection, the idea that explained everything. Of course, today there are still scientists who receive recognition for realizing when two different organisms are of different species, but only to the extent that such information can flesh out and elucidate the bigger idea, the idea that explains everything. And I think the same situation has been very much applicable to us. I think that we've been afflicted by a terrible case of myopathy, and I think that we've been focusing too narrowly on the differences and not enough on the similarities. And that's not to say that I think that the differences are not important. I'm not saying that we can sweep them aside and sing Kumbaya or anything like that. I'm not asking for tolerance, I'm asking for understanding. I think that the differences are important, but again, only to the extent that such information can flesh out and elucidate the bigger idea, the idea that explains everything. I think that if we can come to a better understanding of how we start from a default state and arrive at different worldviews by way of different perspectives, I think that we will not only be in a better position from which to critique another worldview, not just to criticize it and say you're fucked up, you're wrong, and none of your beliefs are consistent with reality, but that we can actually provide some constructive criticism on how to facilitate a change in perspectives such that there can be a more harmonious transition from one worldview to the next. That, again, if we can influence and affect those foundational perceptions, I think that the beliefs will follow. And, we keep on talking about how traumatic the transition or the deconversion was, that in going from a state of belief to a state of non-belief, that a lot of people had some really tremendous difficulties because of how ungrounding it all was. But I think that if we can really understand what's going on, if we have a better grasp of what's really happening, then we should be able to form a framework that would facilitate these transitions much more smoothly. So I just want to bring that into focus and to bring that to your attention. Hopefully this will spur some new dialogue, push some new discussion, and sort of get the ball rolling again. Because, again, I keep getting the feeling that the well of ideas has been drying up around here, and I think it's about time that we replenish that. That's about all I've got. Just as a quick update, I do have a bigger angle in terms of where I'm going with how we perceive intelligence and what it all means. Obviously, I started that with my God is Not God series, and I will be continuing that into my God in Chaos series, so hopefully you look forward to that. I'll be providing some new angles and some new analyses that hopefully you'll find useful. So that's all I've got, and thanks for watching.